everybody, and welcome to the Quitcast channel. My name is Becca Letter. I am an author success coach, and my whole goal is to try to help authors have an author career for their entire life. And that is the reason that we are doing some of these Quitcast primers. And if you're not familiar with, if you haven't been paying attention to this channel for very long, if you're not familiar with what we do here, we specialize in author alignment, in the ability to provide some guidelines for what to say no to, because there's just too much out there that we can't say yes to everything. And so every single person is completely different in what they need to get out of this career. And my goal is to try to help provide you as an individual some ways to decide what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. This primer series, as we start going through some of these concepts that we talk about a lot, we asked our Facebook community, the Patreon, and the newsletter for some suggestions about what do we use all the time that you would like us to explain? What words do we use on the channel that you want us to explain? So if you do have more questions than the ones that we cover, make sure that you join the Patreon or join the newsletter, betterfasteracademy.com, so that you can join the conversation. Today, we're going to start talking about a concept we call QTP, or question the premise. So what is QTPing? If you are at all a person who likes to learn things or likes to ask other people for advice, you will get someone telling you what you should do. So when someone says you should do this, you should do that, you should run ads, you should join TikTok, you should, et cetera, they are essentially giving you a premise that they have decided is true for you. For whatever reason they're deciding this, they have decided it. So it's either best practice that they've heard this is something that is good for people, or it's something that has been successful for them. And so depending on how certain they are when they tell you this thing, they are giving you a piece of advice and they're saying you should do this thing. So when you hear someone giving you a piece of advice, you should outline to get faster, you should, et cetera, then that's a premise. And we are just accepting the premise of whatever advice they're giving us. And the majority of us are doing that with an assumption that we're either experimenting or we're going to try it out or see how it works. And so I'm not saying that it's wrong to accept premises, but because we are getting so many of them, we're getting so much advice. My goal when I started talking about QTP was to say, could we just question whether that's a good piece of advice to even consider from the beginning? Rather than just accepting the premise, how about we question the premise? So question the premise looks like this. Rather than accepting it, I try to look for what are the assumptions I'm making underneath of that thing. So just as a, for instance, the one that I almost always use to start off with is you should outline your books to get faster, because it makes a fundamental assumption. Well, it makes a couple, but it makes a fundamental assumption about what outlining does to every single human brain. So it makes an assumption that every single person can write what they outline, or should write what they outline, or should be able to. And that premise, given what we know about people's personality and how people's brains work differently, that is a faulty assumption. And it's based on a core premise that there is a best practice, that outlining is the best practice. And if you just assimilate the best practice, then you will be able to get faster. The problem is you don't have to go very far in author groups or on Twitter or really anywhere that authors are talking at conferences to hear that there are plenty of successful people who don't outline and also can't outline, where they will talk about outlining and they will tell you, I tried to outline the book and then I couldn't write it. Or I tried to outline the book and then I couldn't even start because I knew that the outline was wrong. Or I couldn't even start outlining because I don't know what happens until I start writing the book. And then they're trying to figure out, but the best practice is outlining, so I should really figure out how to outline. And we say, hang on a second. And the first place we look to question the premise is, are there other successful people who are doing this exact same thing? Like, are there other extremely successful authors who don't outline? And you don't have to do very much looking to find that there are indeed several successful, and not just like several, like 10, but several, like hundreds of successful authors who are not outlining in order to get faster in their books. Or when they talk about outlining, they are not able to write, or they can't write what they outline, or the outlining doesn't help them, or whatever it is. So when we hear a premise like, in order to write faster, you should outline your book, and then we don't jive with it, then we need to question that assumption. So we want to start by looking at, are there other potential successful authors who are not doing that thing? And if so, then we need to assume that it's not necessary for everyone to do. The second part of question the premise, though, is, are there any assumptions I'm making about myself and my capacity that are faulty? So not all brains work by taking a very concrete set of expectations and then expecting you to creatively move through those expectations. And again, it just doesn't take very much searching to see other successful people talking about this. And so it's important to take that second piece also as it is enough to say, I have tried it every way and it doesn't work for me. That is enough. Sometimes, depending on how intuitive you are, and again, we're going to do a primer on being intuitive, but depending on how intuitive you are, it may be enough to say, my intuition is telling me that this is not a good fit for me. That is enough of a reason. So the question, the premise is looking for the assumptions that we're making, and are any of them faulty? And a lot of us think that we're not making any assumptions because we're saying, well, this is what everyone says you have to do. Anytime you hear yourself say, this is what everyone says, I guarantee you, you're just not listening to enough people. Because I've been around this industry for long enough, and I've coached enough people. I've coached more than 6,000 individual people at this point in 2023. I've coached enough successful people to know that there has never been anything, including using author alignment or using strengths or using Enneagram. There is nothing that everyone does who is successful. Zero, including hard work, including everything. Like, there's just nothing that every single person does. So anytime you hear a premise that is given, what we always want to do is question whether or not that works. And I do think that it is important to say, I'm a fan of experimentation. If you still feel really strongly like you want to try the thing, no matter what it seems like either your personality or your background or your training is telling you, and you still want to try the thing, that's a reasonable thing to do. There are a lot of us who are wired to just experiment and learn from our experimentation. And if that's what you are, if that's the type of person that you are, then please feel free to do it no matter what we say on the Quitcast. Because that's the other thing about question the premise. Sometimes when we question the premise, the answer is, yeah, I think I should believe that thing. But a lot of us get into the deconstructing of the questioning the premise, right? Where it's like, let's see if this piece of advice works for everyone, which the general rule for this, for me, is that it still is just only a bare majority of people that this works for. So anything that we've looked into in terms of like high numbers of people who have experimented with it, it still is just barely over 50%, somewhere between like 50, 60, 70% of people. It is not 100. It's nowhere near 100 that this thing works for. It still is just barely the majority when it is actually like either or questions. So it's important to know that when you're talking about being outside of the majority, that still is a lot of potential people. So even if we were to say, let's follow standard deviation, where we're going more like 2/3 it works for and 1/3 it doesn't. If you think about 1/3 of writers, and there's 2 million writers roughly, then that means that a third of 2 million, there's a good chance you could be in that 1/3 that this tactic isn't working for, even if it's working for 2/3 of people. I think this is the pain point of alignment, right? Is that there are going to be things where you fall outside of the majority on, where a lot of your friends might be doing this thing that everyone says you should do, but you don't fall in that majority. And you need to know, and this is why QTP is such an important thing for me. You need to know that it's okay for you to be outside of that majority. You do not have to fall inside of the majority in order to be doing it right. In fact, for a lot of things, when you are following what everyone else says to do and following what everyone else is doing, you're likely only following people because they're doing it and not because it's actually working for everyone. And there are so many examples of this. We're going to talk more about them in the primer series, but I wanted to start off with just a primer about question the premise so that when I refer back to QTP, I can say, we did a primer on QTP. Go check out that episode. And this is that episode. So if you're coming back to us from the future to listen to us because we referenced this primer somewhere else, hi from the future. The past is still here for you and still helping. So thank you so much for listening to this primer episode. We're going to do more of these in the future. I hope this was helpful. And we will continue to talk about what to keep, what to quit, and what to question in future episodes of the Quitcast. Bye, everybody.